So today we're gonna dive into the ransomware business. But before we can dive into the business side of things, let's look at what ransomware is. I'm pretty sure that most of you actually know about it. So traditionally, the ransomware is like malicious software that just prevents you from accessing either your computer or data or resources, essentially. But that was traditionally some long, or feels like long time ago in the internet spaces, right? So modern ransomware looks quite differently. Compared to the traditional one, modern ransomware utilizes a number of different cyber attacks. So it's not necessarily just encrypting your resources and making them unavailable. It can also be used, for example, DDoS attacks, demanding the ransomware to stop the DDoS attacks, or stealing the data and demanding the ransom for not disclosing that stolen data. So modern ransomware can also be categorized in double, triple extortion schemes. We encrypted your data, we also stolen it. So now you have to pay for both our decryption and the fact that or the promise to not disclose your data. It also has leak sites. So that's where the stolen data gets published if you don't pay the ransom, or so the ransomware group says. It also has a number of products or uses ransomware-as-a-service or crime-as-a-service platforms, and we'll talk a little bit about that later on. And it uses a number of different tools and attacks and ways essentially to either deploy the ransom or execute a cyber attack and demand the ransom in some other ways. So traditionally, now we're diving into the business side of things. So traditionally, the ransomware, it was more like hackers doing stuff for the fun or doing stuff for, well, money, essentially, financial motivation. But nowadays, this has grown into the big criminal enterprises and criminal business. So it no longer looks like the hacker, it more looks like the enterprise business. Let's take a look at a few examples. So one of the ransomware organizations, it used to be Conte. It's not so much active anymore. And they had around 100 employees. So they had a number of teams or departments. They had human resources that were responsible for hiring employees. Yes, we should call them employees. They had the engineering department, so that's basically responsibility for development of the malware, of integrations, just like in the regular fintech companies who work on developing their own platforms and products. They had quality assurance, so that's testing malware, making sure that they work against all of the security products and they don't stop the malware from executing. They have obviously administrators and the DevOps, so the people who support the attack infrastructure, but also they are responsible for their internal ransomware group business IT systems, because ransomware groups also, like regular companies, have their own internal business IT systems that they need to function. Obviously, they have the reverse engineers, so they do the code analysis, they identify the vulnerabilities because to make sure that the ransomware can execute in the companies and it can be deployed. And we have the pen testers, hackers. So in the normal fintech companies, for example, the pen testers, hackers, they do the assessments for us so that we can improve our infrastructure. On the ransomware organizations, they fight the security teams and make sure that the ransomware can be deployed. So that's one example of the ransomware organization. Another, a bit of a different way of organizing itself is Logbit, another pretty popular, used to be a pretty big ransomware group. So they went a different, not so much enterprise route. They went more like cartels or alliances or partnerships, wherever you call it, you name it. And Red Sense has done an extensive analysis on exactly how they relate to one another, all the different parties in that alliance building. An example could be from Black Matter, for example. Black Matter claimed that they are shutting down and they're transferring all of their victims to Logbit for whatever reason. And essentially, we can see the same relation when we analyze the ransomware payments. We can see that there's a lot of overlap between for example, wallet addresses and so on, used between the Logbit and the Black Matter ransomware groups. So this is a different way of organizing our ransomware business. Well, not our really Logbit's ransomware business, but still it seems like a business, right? Just like we have different ways of organizing our businesses. Also, the ransomware business, some ransomware groups, they have internal support, but some outsource support. Just like us, we sometimes have internally this function, sometimes outsource externally. And when we have this outsourced support business, obviously they say like, hey, what you're up to? And the support says like, well, we're waiting for the attacker's report because it's outsourced business, so they don't know what's happening there, just the first line support. And the victim organization asks like, how many of you are? And there's like many of us. We're like support business function, right? And just like the regular support, when you deal with a lot of unhappy customers, and so it happens when there's ransomware victims, they often are pretty unhappy. It's pretty tough for the support function, and they kind of not so well paid and a bit unhappy. They like it is terrible communicating with so many customers, and you know, we should be well paid, but unfortunately we're not, and we can't really disclose how much are we paid there. And the ransomware groups, just like regular businesses, they also care about their image. So sometimes they offer PR deals. They say like, you know, we're responsible. We didn't mean to hack the healthcare organization. If you tell us that we're a good ransomware group, we're just, you know, offer you the key and not gonna demand the ransom there. And also sometimes this business just has too many customers. So for the support, you have to wait in the line, just like sometimes we have to wait in the line when we need to talk to the support for our like financial institutions. If we look closer at the ransomware ecosystems, there are a number of stakeholders involved in this whole big operations, or the ecosystems, if we call it that way. Obviously, there are threat actors. There are also security specialists, like forensic investigators who help to deal with ransomware attacks, but also just any security specialists who work on defending the organization. The law enforcement, the actions from the law enforcement also influence the ecosystem pretty much. So any takedowns make the operations risky, disrupt the infrastructure, and so on. And obviously, if there are sanctions or legislations related to ransomware payments, that disrupts the ecosystem as well. If we have insurance companies involved, there are a number of ransomware groups and examples where the ransom demands were exactly equal to the insurance coverage. So that plays a role as well. We have ransomware negotiators. Oftentimes, this is a third parties who help to negotiate, whether it's to take the ransomware payment down or try to understand where or how the intrusion happened, obtain the evidence that this is the real case or what exactly they accessed. But also they often help to facilitate the ransomware payments if the ransomware payments are made. We have security providers and vendors. The better their products are, the more difficult it is to execute the ransomware operations or attacks. But at the same time, it forces the ransomware groups to innovate a lot. So one of the newest newcomers in the ransomware group space is Ransom Hub, and they added methods and ways essentially to disable the endpoint detection and response systems. So they try to innovate to keep up and make sure that their operations are running as well. National government entities, some of the nations actually use ransomware groups in their geopolitical situations or goals. And financial and crypto institutions are part of how the ransomware payments essentially are made, but also they can help to track and prevent the ransomware payments in the long run. So a lot of those, and if we look at the specific threat actors that are mostly involved in the ransomware ecosystem and operations, we have the initial access brokers. So they are some specially organized groups, for example, who generally specializes in gaining the access to organizations, maintaining the persistence, and then selling that access to others. It can be through, for example, exposed or leaked credentials. And an example of those could be the exotic lilies. So we looked at the Conte ransomware group in the beginning, the one that had 100 employees, and they work closely with the exotic lily, which is an initial access broker organization there. Then we have the affiliates. So those are the ones that conduct the attacks. They infect the victims. They can use either initial access brokers. They can also get the playbooks from the ransomware groups to facilitate and make the attacks easier. And they can also move between the different ransomware groups, depending who pays more, what's the commission there that they're getting, what's the service, what's the availability, because some ransomware groups get, discontinued, especially if the law enforcement gets involved there. And we have the ransomware groups themselves, obviously. So they develop the ransomware, they host the leak sites, they do the administrative part there, they manage the infrastructure for negotiations, for payments, and so on. And if we look specifically at as the ransomware-as-a-service operations and schemes, so we already said we have the affiliates and we have the ransomware-as-a-service or builders who build the products. And if we look at those schemes or operations, there's more well understood the relationship between affiliates and the builders, the ransomware-as-a-service, where builders develop the ransomware products, the affiliates execute the attacks, and they share the profit. But there's also some private schemes. So they usually don't hire externally. They have many of the operations in-house, or they have very close networks to get everything up, running, and done. And for the investigators, it's the hardest. They are the hardest one to analyze because we have usually the least information about them. So we know more about public affiliate programs and ransomware-as-a-service operations. And to make matters even more fun, well, I guess I'm not sure if that's the right way to say, but I guess fun in this presentation, we have a number as a service options that make the criminal business boom and bloom and so on. So we had ransomware as a service. Those were the ones who build the ransomware that can be used then by other affiliates to execute the commands. But there's also access as a service. Well, let's say you have something, but you don't have access to your organizations, you can buy it as a service. There is phishing as a service. Well, you need to send out a lot of phishing emails, but you don't have the infrastructure. You can buy this as a service. Scanning as a service, you need to find the vulnerabilities for the organization. There's a service for you that you can buy and so on. So it's a lot of supply chain elements that you can use from the market, the criminal market, to basically make your operations, your business operations, more effective. And generally called crime as a service, so like DDoS as a service, if you want to DDoS some institution there, here or there. And usually they have very convenient user interfaces and ways, and they build and make things much more accessible for their customers. I've seen the DDoS as a service user interface before. You just provide the IP address, basically state from when to when you need the DDoS, choose the type of attack, pay, and here it goes. Very convenient, user-friendly there. And just like regular business, our ransomware business have different strategies that they execute. So if we look at the industries, some ransomware groups have preferences, but not necessarily they don't necessarily stick to one or the other industry. So they sort of have preferences. But also there's some ransomware groups who have off-limit industries. So for example, if their affiliate uses their ransomware variant for their attack, for their execution, and chooses the off-limit industry, the affiliate might be thrown out of the program and essentially punished and not get the profit there because this is off-limit. So for example, some ransomware groups had healthcare included as an off-limit industries, but doesn't really work for everyone. So not necessarily that you will be excluded. There's also geopolitical influences, affiliations. So some ransomware groups, they said their business strategies aligned with geopolitical goals. Some maximize per unit cost. So they focus on high payoff, but fewer targets or attacks. This one is pretty tricky because if you're too big or you go after too big targets, you become much more interesting for law enforcement. So other groups focus more on the low cost but high volume. So they go after a number of targets, smaller ransom payment demands, but much more attacks. So they get the revenue that way. And essentially some choose more like a middle ground, some higher payments, some middle volumes to generate the revenue. So they also have different business strategies, but those business strategies evolve and adjust depending on the situation. So some groups started going from high payoff, but then realized quickly that too many eyes are looking at them, it's not great. So they switch to a different strategy. And then we have the ransomware payments. So in this flow, the important part is over-the-counter desks that are often used to facilitate the ransomware payments, where the cryptocurrencies payments go directly between buyer and payer without involving the exchanges. Then they go to the ransomware wallet. They can either be laundered first or split first. And usually there's a split between the ransomware operator and affiliate. So we saw the Conte group. So the Conte had about 30% split for the ransomware operator and 70% split for the affiliate. On the other hand, we also looked at the Logbit. Logbit was more generous. They had like 80% for the affiliate, 20% for them. And what has been observed is essentially that the split can increase if the ransom demands are increasing over the time. And what's driving the growth? Well, profit. So the ransom demands and payments are essentially growing over the years. They're becoming more and more. So the biggest one that has been this year, which is an outlier currently, but we'll have to see how the trends go forward. So it was 75 million paid to Dark Angels, but generally the average ransomware payments continues to increase. So we're observing this trend, and this profit attracts a lot of newcomers who are specializing in ransomware operations, but also there are a number of already existed criminal groups who diversify. They say like, hey, we can also add the ransomware to our portfolio. Obviously, there's a scalability, which is enabled by the affiliate programs. Now we have the ransomware-as-a-service, which is easier to obtain. So there are more groups who can basically join and make profit there, and continuous growth and innovation. So what about the API? I was the only person not having API in my in the name of my talk, but I still gonna talk about the API. So API use or abuse in the ransomware operations. If we think about the traditional ransomware, the API doesn't really get involved there so much, like in the sense of encryption and so on. But if we talk about the modern ransomware, then we get to see where the API comes or API security comes into the picture. So essentially, it's APIs can be used to exfiltrate or siphon the data and then demand the ransom for it, which for some ransomware groups like Mace introduced this at some point ago, said why bother encrypting if everyone's willing more to pay for the stolen data than they are for the decryption, and everyone has backups, like too bothersome. Let's just steal the data and demand the ransom. So that's where the API comes into the picture, essentially, especially the leaky APIs, misconfigured APIs. And one example that we can look at is from Optus, the Australian telecom, which had over 9 million of their customer PII data exposed. And this was done through a code error in the API, which broke the authentication. And it was sort of a forgotten dormant API, but exposed to the internet and essentially leaked a bunch of PII data. And there has been some ransom demands on the forums. But eventually, the attacker saw that there's too much interest in this case, and they retracted the demand and said, "Too many eyes there. We're not going to demand ransomware anymore." But the data that was shared on the forum eventually got copied, and now probably is being used in some other attacks, phishing attempts, and so on and so on. So that's pretty much it about the whole ransomware business and API involvement in this whole ransomware business operations.